down to his last $900 and facing homelessness after losing everything in a devastating market crash, Jackson Miller made a desperate decision to buy an abandoned farm at a county auction that nobody else wanted. What he discovered hidden in the attic would not only change his life forever, but would uncover a mystery that had been waiting decades to be solved. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Jackson Miller stared at his bank account balance on his phone screen, $1937.42. Just 3 years ago, he had been a successful investment broker with a corner office, a luxury apartment, and over 7 figures in his personal accounts. Now, at 42, he was living out of his car, showering at a local gym, and counting every dollar. The economic downturn had hit everyone hard, but Jackson had been particularly devastated. He had over-leveraged himself, convinced that his understanding of the market would protect him. When everything collapsed, he lost his clients, his job, his savings, and finally, his home. His wife, Caroline, had left him shortly after, taking what little remained of their joint assets. "You're too proud, Jackson," she had said on her way out. "You need to learn when to ask for help." But pride was all Jackson had left. He refused to call his parents or his more successful brother. He was determined to fix this himself, to find his own way back. As he sat in his car outside the county courthouse, he noticed a flyer for an upcoming property auction. Most of the listings were for foreclosed homes with starting bids well beyond his means, but one caught his eye, an abandoned farm property with a dilapidated farmhouse 60 miles outside the city. The minimum bid was listed as $900. Jackson had grown up in a small farming community before escaping to the city as soon as he could. He had sworn never to return to that life, to the endless work and modest returns. But now, with his options dwindling and winter approaching, even a rundown farmhouse seemed better than sleeping in his car. The next day, Jackson arrived at the auction early. The property photos showed a weathered 2-story farmhouse with peeling paint, broken windows, and an overgrown yard. The listing mentioned no running water, questionable electrical wiring, and possible structural issues. Not surprisingly, when the auctioneer called for bids, the room remained silent. $900, Jackson called out, his voice echoing in the quiet room. A few heads turned in surprise, but no competing bids followed. "Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman in the back," the auctioneer announced, seeming relieved to have moved the property at all. As Jackson signed the paperwork and handed over nearly every dollar he had left, the county clerk looked at him with a mixture of pity and confusion. "You know, Mr. Miller, there's a reason no one wanted that place," she said quietly. "The Thompson farm has been abandoned for nearly 20 years. Old man Thompson was, well, let's just say he wasn't well liked around here. Some folks say that place is cursed." Jackson forced a smile. "I don't believe in curses, ma'am, just opportunities." But as he drove the 60 miles to his new property, doubt began to creep in. What had he done? He knew nothing about farming or home repair. He had just spent his last dollars on a property that might be beyond saving. When he finally turned onto the long gravel driveway, the reality of his purchase hit him full force. The farmhouse stood on a small hill, silhouetted against the setting sun, looking even more desolate than in the photos. The roof sagged in places, the porch steps were rotting, and the fields that stretched out behind the house were overrun with weeds and small trees. "What have I gotten myself into?" he whispered, as he parked his car and stepped out into his new life. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and what little courage he had left, Jackson pushed open the front door. It creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty house. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the wooden floorboards groaned beneath his feet. The wallpaper, once probably cheerful and bright, now hung in tattered strips, revealing the plaster beneath. In what must have been the living room, a moth-eaten couch and a broken rocking chair remained, as if the previous owners had left in a hurry. The kitchen was in no better shape, with rusted appliances from at least 30 years ago and cabinets that hung off their hinges. Jackson shone his flashlight upstairs, where a narrow staircase led to what he assumed were the bedrooms. He was too exhausted to explore further that night. Instead, he returned to his car, grabbed a sleeping bag, and made a makeshift bed on the dusty living room floor. It wasn't comfortable, but it beat sleeping in his car for another night. As he lay there in the darkness, listening to the strange noises of the old house settling, Jackson wondered if he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He had been desperate, yes, but had he been desperate enough to throw away his last chance at starting over? Morning came with a shaft of sunlight through the broken living room window, illuminating the dust particles dancing in the air. Jackson woke stiff and sore, but with a renewed determination. He had made his choice, and now he had to make it work. He spent the day taking inventory of the property. The farmhouse, while dilapidated, had good bones. The roof needed work but wasn't beyond repair. The plumbing was ancient but intact. The electrical system would need to be completely redone, but that could wait. There was a well on the property that, once cleaned out, could provide water. The barn, though sagging in places, could still serve its purpose. The fields were overgrown but not ruined. With work, a lot of work, this place could be productive again. By evening, Jackson had cleared enough debris from the kitchen to make it somewhat functional and had swept one of the bedrooms clean enough to move his sleeping bag upstairs. He had also discovered a generator in the barn that miraculously still worked with a bit of tinkering. It wasn't much, but it was progress. As night fell again, Jackson sat on the porch steps, watching the sunset over his land. His land, despite everything. There was something satisfying about that thought. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't until the third day that Jackson ventured into the attic. He had been avoiding it, partly because the pull-down ladder looked unstable, and partly because the thought of what might be living up there, rats, raccoons, or worse, was unsettling. But curiosity finally got the better of him. With a flashlight clenched between his teeth, Jackson carefully climbed the creaking ladder into the musty darkness above. Little did he know that what awaited him there would change everything. A discovery that would turn his desperate last chance into something he could never have imagined. The attic was even more dust-filled than the rest of the house, with cobwebs hanging like curtains across the low-beamed ceiling. Jackson's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing piles of forgotten items, old furniture covered in yellowed sheets, trunks with rusted latches, stacks of newspapers dating back decades. The air was thick and stale, carrying the unmistakable smell of abandonment and decay. Jackson moved carefully across the creaking floorboards, mindful of any weak spots that might give way beneath his weight. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, perhaps something salvageable he could clean up and sell, or at the very least, items he could use to furnish the empty rooms below. As his light swept across the attic, something caught his eye. A faded painting leaning against the far wall. It depicted a stern-looking man in old-fashioned clothing, standing in front of what appeared to be this very farmhouse, though in much better condition. The man's eyes seemed to follow Jackson as he approached, creating an unsettling sensation that made the hairs on his neck stand up. "You must be old man Thompson," Jackson muttered, studying the portrait. The man had a hard, uncompromising face, with deep-set eyes, and a mouth fixed in what seemed to be a permanent scowl. There was something about him that struck Jackson as familiar, though he couldn't place why. As Jackson moved the painting aside, he noticed a loose floorboard behind it. Curious, he knelt down and pulled at the board, which came away with surprising ease, as if it had been designed to be removed. Beneath it was a small, hollow space, and inside that space, a metal lockbox. Jackson's pulse quickened as he lifted the box out. It was heavier than he expected, with a simple padlock securing. It shut. The lock was old and rusted, but still held firm. Jackson looked around for something to break it with and spotted an old hammer among the scattered tools in the corner of the attic. With a few solid strikes, the padlock gave way, falling to the floor with a dull thud. Jackson hesitated, suddenly, aware that he was about to cross a line. Whatever was in this box had been deliberately hidden. Did he have the right to open it? Curiosity won out over hesitation. Slowly, he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded cloth, was a stack of documents, a small leather-bound journal, and, Jackson's breath caught in his throat, several banded stacks of cash. His hands trembled as he lifted one of the stacks. The bills were old, some dating back to the 1960s, but they were real. Very real. He quickly counted the first stack, $5,000. Then the second and the third. In total, the box contained just over $50,000 in cash. "Holy shit," Jackson whispered, his voice echoing in the empty attic. He set the money aside and picked up the journal, carefully opening its brittle pages. The handwriting inside was cramped and urgent, dated entries spanning from 1967 to 1982. He flipped through, catching snippets of text. "Shipment arrived today. And meeting with R at the usual place." Cannot trust anyone at this point. The last entry caught his eye. May 15th, 1982. "They're coming. I can feel it. If found, this journal will explain everything. The real treasure isn't just what's in this box. The farm holds secrets worth millions, but only to someone who knows where to look. I've hidden the map where only a worthy successor would think to search." Jackson's mind reeled. Secrets worth millions. A map. He shuffled through the other documents in the box, property deeds, old receipts, and finally a black and white photograph. It showed a group of 6 men standing in front of a barn, not the barn on this property, but a similar one. They were all wearing suits despite the rural setting, and none were smiling. On the back, written in the same cramped handwriting, were the words, "The Brotherhood, 1965. One of the men in the photo was unmistakably the same man from the portrait. Old. Men Thompson. But there was something else that made Jackson's blood run cold. Standing next to Thompson was a man who looked eerily like Jackson's own grandfather, a man he'd never met but had seen in family photos. "What the hell?" Jackson murmured, bringing the photo closer to his face. It couldn't be a coincidence. But his family had never mentioned any connection to this place or to anyone named Thompson. The sound of a car engine outside snapped Jackson back to reality. He quickly returned everything to the box, except for one stack of cash which he pocketed, and carried the box downstairs. Through the grimy front window, he saw a pickup truck coming up the driveway, dust billowing behind it. Jackson's heart pounded. He hadn't met any neighbors yet, hadn't told anyone he was here. Who would be visiting this abandoned property? He quickly hid the box under the sink in the kitchen and went to the front door, trying to compose himself. The truck came to a stop, and a man in his 60s stepped out. He was tall and weathered, with deep creases around his eyes, suggesting a lifetime spent outdoors. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt, the quintessential farmer. He approached the house with a purposeful stride, his eyes taking in every detail of the property, and Jackson's car parked beside it. "Hello there," the man called out as he neared the porch. "Saw someone finally bought this old place. Thought I'd come introduce myself. Name's Ray Harker, own the farm next door." He extended a calloused hand. Jackson shook it, noting the firm grip. "Jackson Miller, just moved in a few days ago." Ray nodded, his eyes scanning the house behind Jackson. "Quite a project you've taken on." This place has been sitting empty for almost 20 years. So I've heard, Jackson replied, trying to sound casual. The price was right. Ray's expression remained neutral, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Mind if I ask what brought you out here? Not many city folks looking to take on an old farm like this? The question seemed innocent enough, but something in Ray's tone made Jackson cautious. How did Ray know he was from the city? Needed a change, Jackson said simply. Economy's bad everywhere. Thought I might try my hand at something different. Ray nodded slowly. Thompson wasn't much of a farmer, you know. Bought this place back in '63, but never did much with it. Always seemed to have money, though. People wondered about that. Jackson's pulse quickened again. Did you know him well? Ray chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Nobody knew Charlie Thompson well, kept to himself, had visitors sometimes, city types in nice cars. Always at night. He paused, studying Jackson's face. You remind me of someone. Ever been to this area before? No, Jackson said, perhaps too quickly. Never. Ray held his gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Well, just wanted to welcome you to the neighborhood. Word of advice, this place has a history. Might be best to leave some stones unturned. He turned to leave, then stopped. Oh, and if you happen to need help with anything, my number's on the mailbox down at the end of my drive, though I suspect you might be getting other visitors soon enough. With that cryptic comment, Ray walked back to his truck, leaving Jackson standing on the porch with a growing sense of unease. As Ray drove away, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that the man knew something, perhaps about the money in the attic, or the mysterious brotherhood, or even about Jackson's apparent connection to this place. That night, as Jackson sat at the rickety kitchen table with the contents of the lockbox spread out before him, he tried to make sense of it all. The money was real enough, a small fortune by his current standards, but nowhere near the millions mentioned in the journal. The real value, according to Old Man Thompson, was somewhere else on the property, hidden in a location that only a worthy successor would find. Jackson flipped through the journal again, reading more carefully now. Most entries were vague, referencing meetings, shipments, and concerns about being watched, but there were occasional mentions of the operation, the product, and the network. The more he read, the more convinced Jackson became that Thompson had been involved in something illegal, smuggling perhaps, or some other illicit enterprise run from this isolated farm. But why would his grandfather be in that photograph? What connection did his family have to Thompson and this brotherhood? As the night wore on, Jackson became increasingly paranoid. Ray's warning echoed in his mind. You might be getting other visitors soon enough. Who was coming? And what did they want? With $50,000 now hidden under a loose floorboard in his bedroom and more questions than answers, Jackson found it impossible to sleep. Every creak of the old house, every whisper of wind through the broken windows, made him start. By morning he had made a decision. He would use some of the money to make basic repairs to the house, enough to make it properly livable. Then he would methodically search every inch of the property for Thompson's map and the greater treasure it supposedly led to. Whatever secrets this farm held, Jackson was now determined to uncover them all. His desperation had given way to something else, an insatiable curiosity, and a growing suspicion that his arrival here was not mere chance. There was a connection between him and this place, and he wouldn't rest until he discovered what it was. The next morning, Jackson woke with the first light of dawn. Despite his restless night, he felt a surge of energy that had been absent for months. The discovery in the attic had changed everything, not just because of the money, but because of the mystery it represented. For the first time since his financial collapse, he had a purpose beyond mere survival. After a quick breakfast of instant coffee and a granola bar, the last of his meager supplies, Jackson drove into the nearest town, a small farming community called Millfield, about 15 miles from the farm. With $5,000 in cash tucked securely in his wallet, he felt a confidence he hadn't experienced in a long time. The Millfield hardware store was his first stop. A bell jingled as he pushed open the door, and the scent of sawdust and metal greeted him. The store was cramped but well organized, with narrow aisles packed floor to ceiling with tools, materials, and supplies. "Morning," called out an elderly man from behind the counter. His name tag read, "Frank. What can I help you with today?" "I just bought the old Thompson place," Jackson said, watching carefully for the man's reaction. Frank's bushy eyebrows shot up. "Thompson place, huh? Been empty a long time. Gonna need a lot of work." "That's why I'm here," Jackson replied with a smile. "Need to pick up some basics. Roofing materials, lumber for structural repairs, plumbing supplies, and a good toolbox. Most of mine are in storage." He couldn't bring himself to admit he'd had to sell his tools months ago to pay rent. "Thompson place?" Frank repeated, shaking his head. "You know, there are easier fixer-uppers in the county." "I like a challenge," Jackson said. "Did you know Thompson?" Frank's expression became guarded. Everybody knew of Charlie Thompson, but nobody really knew him, if you get my meaning. Kept to himself. Had money, though. Never understood where it came from. Wasn't from farming, that's for sure. This echoed what Ray had said the day before. Jackson pressed a little further. "I found an old photograph in the house. Looked like Thompson was part of some group called the Brotherhood. Any idea what that might be?" Frank's hands, which had been ringing up Jackson's purchases, went still. His eyes, previously friendly, now became hard and distant. "Can't say that I do. Probably just a social club or something from back in the day." His tone made it clear the conversation was over. Jackson didn't push further. He paid for his supplies, nearly $2,000 worth, and arranged for delivery the next day. As he was leaving, Frank called after him. "Word of advice, young man. Some things in this county, they're best left in the past. You focus on fixing up that house and don't go digging into what don't concern you." It was the second warning he'd received in as many days. Jackson nodded politely, but internally, his resolve only strengthened. Whatever secrets the Thompson farm held, the locals were clearly aware of them, and for some reason, they didn't want those secrets uncovered. His next stop was the county records office. The building was small and outdated, with filing cabinets lining the walls, and a single elderly woman working at a desk in the center of the room. "I'm researching the history of my property," Jackson explained after introducing himself. "The old Thompson farm." The woman, Mrs. Grayson, according to her nameplate, gave him a long look. "That's quite a purchase you made. What exactly are you looking for?" "Previous owners, property boundaries, any significant events associated with the land. Just trying to get a complete picture." Mrs. Grayson nodded and disappeared into the maze of filing cabinets. She returned several minutes later with a thin folder. "Property records go back to 1920. Before that, it was part of the original Henderson estate that covered most of the northern county." Jackson thanked her and sat down at a small table to review the documents. The farm had changed hands several times before Thompson bought it in 1963. The previous owner had been a man named James Miller. Miller, Jackson's own last name. His heart raced as he checked the dates. James Miller had owned the property from 1951 to 1963, selling it the same year Jackson's father was born. Could this James Miller be a relative? His grandfather, perhaps? "Mrs. Grayson," he called, trying to keep his voice steady. "Do you have any personal information on this James Miller?" "I think he might be related to me." Mrs. Grayson frowned. "Those records would be in the genealogical section. Birth certificates, death certificates, that sort of thing. I can check for you." While she searched, Jackson continued reading. What he found next made his blood run cold. According to the sale documents, Thompson had paid 5 times the market value for the property in 1963. No explanation was given for the inflated price. Here we are, Mrs. Grayson said, returning with another folder. James Miller, born 1925, died 1983. Married to Eleanor Miller, née Thompson, in 1949. She squinted at Jackson. There's a resemblance, now that I look at you. Thompson. Eleanor Thompson. Could she have been related to Charlie Thompson? Does it say anything about children? Jackson asked. Mrs. Grayson skimmed the document. One son, Robert Miller, born 1963. Robert Miller was Jackson's father. Jackson felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. His father had never mentioned growing up in this area, never talked about his parents or his childhood. Jackson had always assumed his grandparents had lived and died in the city. Yet here was evidence that not only was his grandfather James Miller once the owner of the very farm Jackson had just purchased, but his grandmother was possibly related to Charlie Thompson himself. Are you all right, young man? You've gone quite pale, Mrs. Grayson said, concern in her voice. Just hungry, I think, Jackson lied. Is there any way I could get copies of these documents? Mrs. Grayson nodded and set about making photocopies. Jackson sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he'd discovered. His father had been born the same year Thompson bought the farm from James Miller at an inflated price. His grandmother was a Thompson, and somewhere in this web of connections was a group called the Brotherhood and hints of illegal activities. None of it made sense, but one thing was becoming clear. Jackson hadn't stumbled upon this farm by accident. Some deeper force, call it fate, destiny, or simple family history, had drawn him back to this place, and now he had even more questions than before. When Mrs. Grayson returned with the copies, Jackson had one more question. Do you happen to know if my father, Robert Miller, still has any connections in this area? Any relatives or old friends? Mrs. Grayson's expression turned sad. Robert left the day after his high school graduation, never came back, not even for his father's funeral. Eleanor moved away after James died. Florida, I think. But there's one person who might know more. Edward Thompson, Charlie's nephew, lives just outside town in that big white house on Maple Street. He and Robert were close once, despite everything that happened between their families. What exactly happened between their families? Jackson asked. Mrs. Grayson shook her head. That's not for me to say. Some things, Mr. Miller, you need to hear from family. As Jackson drove back to the farm, his mind was spinning with the implications of what he'd learned. His father had grown up here, on this very land. His grandmother was a Thompson. There was bad blood between the families, yet his father and Charlie Thompson's nephew had been close. What had driven his father away, never to return? What was the connection between the mysterious brotherhood, the unexplained wealth, and his own family? Back at the farm, Jackson spread out everything he'd gathered, the journal, the photograph, the property records, and the genealogical information. Piece by piece, he began to construct a timeline. In 1963, his grandfather had sold the farm to Thompson at an inflated price and left the area. That same year, his father was born. 20 years later, his grandfather died, and his grandmother moved away. Thompson himself had disappeared in 1982, according to the journal, presumably fearing that they were coming for him. The questions multiplied, but Jackson was now certain of one thing. The treasure mentioned in Thompson's journal wasn't just about money. It was tied to his family's history, to secrets that had been buried for decades. And he was determined to uncover them all, regardless of who wanted them to stay hidden. With renewed purpose, Jackson grabbed a shovel from the barn and headed out to the fields. If there was a map hidden somewhere on this property, he would find it, and with it, hopefully, the truth about his family's past and the legacy that had unwittingly become his. The next week was a blur of activity. Jackson divided his time between making essential repairs to the farmhouse and searching for clues about Thompson's hidden treasure and his family's connection to this place. The delivery from the hardware store arrived as promised, and Jackson threw himself into work with a vigor that surprised even him. He patched the roof where it leaked, replaced broken windows, and got the plumbing working well enough for basic needs. The old generator from the barn provided enough electricity to run a few lights and his phone charger, though it guzzled gas at an alarming rate. Every evening, exhausted from physical labor, he would pore over Thompson's journal, trying to decipher the cryptic entries. The Brotherhood was mentioned frequently, always in the context of meetings, decisions, and occasional conflicts. There were references to shipments, product, and routes that strongly suggested some sort of smuggling operation. But what were they smuggling, and how was Jackson's grandfather involved? On the fifth day, as Jackson was clearing debris from what must have once been a vegetable garden, he heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. His first thought was that Ray Harker had returned, but the car that pulled up was unfamiliar, a sleek black sedan that looked thoroughly out of place on the dusty farm road. A man in his early 60s stepped out, dressed in khakis and a polo shirt that spoke of wealth and comfort. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and despite his age, he moved with the confidence and vigor of someone much younger. "Jackson Miller," the man called out, approaching with an extended hand. "I'm Edward Thompson. I understand you've been asking about me." Jackson wiped his dirty hand on his jeans before shaking Edward's. "News travels fast around here." "Small communities," Edward said with a thin smile. "No secrets. Well, few secrets anyway." His eyes scanned the farm, taking in the repairs Jackson had begun. "You've been busy. Planning to stay a while?" "That's the plan," Jackson replied, studying the man carefully. This was Charlie Thompson's nephew, possibly his grandmother's relative, and someone who had once been close to his father. "Would you like to come inside? It's not much, but I've got coffee." Edward nodded, and Jackson led him into the house. The kitchen was the most habitable room so far, with a functioning sink and a table Jackson had salvaged from the barn, and "I cleaned up, so," Edward said as Jackson handed him a mug of instant coffee. "I hear you're Robert Miller's son." "You knew my father?" Jackson tried to keep his tone casual. "We grew up together, more or less. Before he left." Edward's eyes narrowed slightly. "He never mentioned me or this place? Jackson shook his head. "Dad wasn't big on talking about the past. I didn't even know he was from here until I checked the county records." Edward studied him for a long moment. "And yet, here you are, buying Charlie Thompson's old farm. Quite a coincidence. I didn't know it was Thompson's farm when I bought it," Jackson said truthfully. "It was just a cheap property at an auction. And now that you know whose farm it was, now that you've presumably found items in this house." The implication was clear. Edward knew about the money, or at least suspected it was here. "I'm not sure what you mean," Jackson said carefully. Edward's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Charlie was my uncle, but we weren't close. He was involved in things. Well, things the family didn't approve of. When he disappeared in '82, no one was particularly surprised. He'd made enemies." "Disappeared?" "The clerk at the auction said he died." "Officially, yes. His car was found abandoned near the state line. Blood in the driver's seat, but no body. After 7 years, he was declared legally dead." Edward sipped his coffee. The general assumption was that his past caught up with him. "And what past was that?" Jackson asked. Edward set down his mug. "Let me be direct, Mr. Miller. Whatever you found in this house, money, documents, other items of value, technically belongs to Charlie's estate. As his closest living relative, that means me." Jackson felt a flare of anger. "I bought this property legally. Everything on it is mine, including hidden assets that weren't disclosed at the time of sale. That's a legal gray area at best." Edward leaned forward. "But I'm not here to threaten legal action. I'm here to offer you a deal. Whatever you've found so far, you keep. In exchange, you share with me anything else you discover, particularly if you find certain maps or documents. So Edward knew about the map too. But how? What's so important about a map? Jackson asked, testing the waters. Edward's expression hardened. Don't play games, Mr. Miller. Your father knew what was hidden here. That's why your grandfather sold this place to Charlie in the first place, to distance your family from what was coming. If Robert sent you back here to find it, at least have the courtesy to be honest about it. The accusation caught Jackson off guard. My father didn't send me. He doesn't even know I'm here. A thought struck him. Wait, is my father still alive? Now it was Edward's turn to look surprised. Of course he is. Living in Arizona last I heard. You didn't know. Jackson felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. His father, the man who had walked out on him and his mother when Jackson was just 12 years old, the man who had been declared dead in a car accident years ago, was alive. There's been some kind of mistake, Jackson said, his voice hollow. My father died when I was a teenager. Edward studied him for a long moment. Robert Miller, born 1963 to James and Eleanor Miller, left Millfield in 1981, married Sandra Collins in 1984, had a son, Hugh, in 1985. He paused. Faked his death in 2000 after certain people started looking for him again. Started a new life in Arizona under the name Richard Matthews. Jackson's world tilted sideways. His father had faked his own death, had been living under a false name. All these years, his mother had always insisted his father was dead, had grieved for him, had raised Jackson alone. Had she known the truth? I think you should leave, Jackson said, standing up abruptly. His hands were shaking. Edward remained seated. You really didn't know? It wasn't a question. Interesting. So what brought you here truly? Mere coincidence or something else? He finally stood. The offer still stands. You keep what you've found. Share what you find next. In return, I can fill in the blanks about your family history, including why your father felt the need to disappear. I'll think about it, Jackson said coldly. Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. My number. Call me when you're ready to talk, or when you find something interesting. He walked to the door, then turned back. One more thing. Be careful who you trust around here. The Brotherhood wasn't just Charlie and your grandfather. Some of its members are still in the area, still protecting their interests. After Edward left, Jackson sat at the kitchen table for nearly an hour, trying to process everything he'd learned. His father was alive. His mother had lied to him his entire adult life. His father and grandfather had been involved in something illicit with Charlie Thompson, this Brotherhood. And whatever they had been involved in was valuable enough that people were still interested decades later. But most disturbing of all was the implication that his arrival at the farm wasn't coincidental. Edward had suggested some greater force at work, some destiny or plan that had brought Jackson back to his family's old property. As the sun began to set, Jackson made a decision. He would continue the search for Thompson's map and the millions it supposedly led to, but he would trust no one, not Ray Harker, not Edward Thompson, not even the official records he'd found. The only truth he could rely on was what he discovered with his own eyes. That night, as a thunderstorm rolled in across the fields, Jackson methodically began taking the farmhouse apart, removing floorboards, checking inside walls, tapping for hollow spaces in the chimney. If there was a map hidden here, he would find it. The storm grew in intensity, rain lashing against the windows and thunder shaking the old house to its foundations. Jackson barely noticed, consumed as he was with his search. By midnight, he had moved into the cellar, a dank space beneath the house that he had avoided until now. The cellar walls were lined with shelves holding ancient preserves and farm equipment. A thick layer of dust covered everything, undisturbed for decades. Jackson moved slowly, shining his flashlight into every corner, behind every jar, under every shelf. As lightning illuminated the small cellar windows, Jackson noticed something odd about one section of the dirt floor. Unlike the rest of the packed earth, this area seemed slightly raised, and the dirt was a subtly different color. Jackson knelt down, brushing away the surface dirt with his hands. Beneath it, he felt something solid. Wood. Heart pounding, he used a rusted garden trowel to scrape away more dirt, revealing what appeared to be a trapdoor set into the cellar floor. There was no handle, no obvious way to open it. Jackson worked his fingers around the edges, trying to get a grip, but the wood was flush with its frame. Growing frustrated, he pressed down hard on different areas of the door, hoping to trigger some kind of releasing mechanism. Just as he was about to give up, a particularly loud crack of thunder shook the house, and Jackson lost his balance, his hand slipping and striking the center of the trapdoor with considerable force. To his surprise, he heard a click, and one edge of the door popped up slightly. Jackson stared at it in disbelief, then slowly lifted the trapdoor. Beneath it was a small, dirt-lined chamber, just big enough to hold a metal container about the size of a shoebox. With trembling hands, Jackson lifted it out. Unlike the lockbox in the attic, this container had no lock. Jackson opened it carefully, half expecting it to be filled with more cash. Instead, he found a single item, an old leather map case, the kind used by military officers in World War II. Inside the case was a map, hand-drawn on what appeared to be parchment rather than paper. It showed the boundaries of the farm, but with additions that weren't on any official survey. Tunnels running beneath the property, connecting the farmhouse to the barn and extending beyond the farm's borders toward what Jackson assumed was Ray Harker's neighboring property. Dex marks were scattered across the map, each labeled with a letter and number code. In the corner of the map was a small pocket, and inside that a folded note in Thompson's now familiar handwriting. To whoever finds this, likely the feds, or worse. The product is gone. We moved it all after Millfield got too hot. The real value was never in the product anyway, but in what we learned in the process. That knowledge is hidden where only family would think to look. Blood calls to blood. Trust no one. Jackson sat back on his heels, the map clutched in his hands. Tunnels. Beneath the farm. Secret codes. Products moved in the dead of night. It all pointed to an elaborate smuggling operation. But what had they been smuggling? Drugs? Alcohol? Something else entirely? And what was the knowledge that Thompson referred to? Knowledge apparently more valuable than whatever they had been smuggling. As Jackson carefully returned to the kitchen, with the map, a new resolution formed in his mind. He would find these tunnels, he would decode the map, and he would discover the truth about his family's involvement in whatever illicit activities had taken place here, regardless of who tried to stop him. Outside, the storm continued to rage, as if nature itself was responding to the unearthing of long-buried secrets. Jackson barely noticed. His attention was fixed entirely on the map and the mystery it represented, a mystery that seemed to grow more personal with each new discovery. As dawn broke over the farm, Jackson finally set the map aside. He'd spent the entire night studying it, comparing it with modern property surveys, and trying to make sense of the tunnel system it depicted. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. The morning sun glinting off raindrops clinging to the overgrown fields. Jackson made a fresh pot of coffee and stepped onto the porch, breathing in the damp, earthy scent of the countryside. Despite the shocking revelations about his father and the increasingly complex mystery surrounding the farm, he felt strangely at peace. For the first time in years, he had purpose. Something beyond the desperate scramble for money and status that had defined his previous life. He was so lost in thought that he almost missed the figure approaching from the direction of Ray Harker's property. It wasn't Ray, however. It was a woman, probably in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves. revealing tanned, muscular arms that spoke of someone accustomed to physical labor. "Morning," she called as she neared the house. "You must be the new owner." Jackson nodded, instantly on guard after his conversation with Edward Thompson. "That's right. Jackson Miller." "Abigail Harker," she said, extending her hand. "Ray's daughter." He mentioned he'd stopped by to introduce himself. Jackson shook her hand, noting the firm grip and the calluses that matched his own newfound ones. "Nice to meet you. Would you like some coffee? Just made a fresh pot." Abigail smiled, revealing a slight dimple in her right cheek. "I never say no to coffee." As they sat at the kitchen table, Jackson studied her surreptitiously. There was something straightforward about Abigail, a lack of pretense that made her easier to trust than either Ray or Edward. Still, after yesterday's revelations, he wasn't taking any chances. "So," Abigail said, wrapping her hands around the mug, "Dad says you bought this place on impulse. No farming experience, no connection to the area." "That's right," Jackson lied, maintaining the story he'd given Ray. Abigail's eyes, a striking hazel that caught the morning light, studied him with undisguised skepticism. "Must have been some impulse. This place has been sitting empty for 2 decades for a reason." "The price was right," Jackson said with a shrug, "and I needed a fresh start." "Don't we all?" Abigail murmured, taking a sip of her coffee. "Well, I didn't just come by to introduce myself. I wanted to make you an offer." Jackson tensed. "What kind of offer?" "A business one," Abigail said, setting down her mug. "I run the Harker farm now. Dad's mostly retired. We could use the extra acreage for crops. Your fields are overgrown, but the soil's good. I'd be willing to lease the farmland from you, not the house or immediate grounds, just the fields. You'd get a steady income without having to learn farming overnight." Jackson considered the proposal. It seemed reasonable. Enough, and God knew he could use a reliable source of income. The money from the attic wouldn't last forever, especially with the continuing repairs the house needed. "What would you grow?" he asked. Something flickered across Abigail's face. Hesitation, perhaps, or calculation. "We rotate crops. Corn, soybeans. Some experimental strains we're developing. We're one of the few organic operations in the county." Jackson nodded slowly. The offer made sense, but he couldn't help wondering if there was more to it. The tunnels on the map seemed to lead toward the Harker property. Was Abigail's offer a way to gain access to the land, to search for whatever might still be hidden there? "I'll think about it," he said finally. Abigail nodded, apparently unsurprised by his caution. "Of course. Take your time." She glanced around the kitchen, noting the repairs he'd already made. "You've done a lot with the place in just a few days." "There's still a long way to go. Well, if you need any help, let me know. I'm pretty handy with tools, and I know what it's like trying to fix up an old place on your own." She stood, leaving her mug on the table. "And that offer stands regardless of whether you lease the fields to us." As she headed for the door, Jackson made a split-second decision. "Abigail," he called after her, "what do you know about the previous owner, Charlie Thompson?" Abigail paused, her back to him. When she turned, her expression was carefully neutral. "Not much. He disappeared before I was born. People say he was into some shady business. And my grandfather, James Miller, he owned this place before Thompson." Now genuine surprise registered on Abigail's face. "Your grandfather? You said you didn't have any connection to this area." Jackson sighed. "I just found out yesterday. County records." Abigail studied him for a long moment, as if deciding how. "Much to say. The Millers and the Thompsons have a complicated history in this county, and the Harkers are tangled up in it too, if you go back far enough." She leaned against the doorframe. "There are stories about a group called the Brotherhood, not the kind of stories people tell outside this valley." "What kind of stories?" Jackson prompted when she fell silent. "The kind that get people killed," Abigail said bluntly. "Look, I don't know what brought you back here, or what you're really looking for, But take some advice from someone who knows this place. Be careful. Who you trust, and be even more careful about what you dig up. Some secrets are buried for a reason. It was almost the exact same warning Edward Thompson had given him, yet coming from Abigail, it felt like genuine concern rather than a threat. "I'm not looking for trouble," Jackson said. "Just trying to understand my family's connection to this place." Abigail's expression softened. "Family history's important, I get that, but in this case, it might be dangerous too." She hesitated, then added, "If you do decide to keep digging, come talk to me first. There are things in my family's records that might help you make sense of what you find. Just be discreet about it. Dad doesn't like to talk about the old days." With that cryptic comment, she left, crossing the yard with long, confident strides. Jackson watched her go, his mind racing with new questions. Abigail clearly knew more than she was saying, but unlike Edward, she seemed genuinely interested in helping him, with conditions, of course, after she disappeared down the path toward the neighboring farm. Jackson returned to the map, the tunnels, the coded locations, the mention of product. It all pointed to some sort of smuggling operation. But the map also showed something else, something he had initially overlooked, a small structure about half a mile into the woods that bordered the farm to the north, marked with the code LB7. Whatever it wasn't visible from the house or any of the fields. If Jackson wanted to find it, he would need to venture into the woods. After changing into more suitable clothes and packing a small backpack with water, a flashlight, and Thompson's map, Jackson set out toward the northern boundary of the property. The woods were dense, with trees growing close together and undergrowth that made progress difficult. He used his phone's GPS to ensure he was heading in the right direction, comparing it occasionally with the map. It took nearly an hour of pushing, through brush, before the trees began to thin slightly, revealing a small clearing ahead. In the center of the clearing stood a structure that at first glance appeared to be nothing more than a dilapidated hunting cabin. It was small, perhaps 12 feet square, with a sagging roof and walls made of rough-hewn logs that had darkened. With age, Jackson approached cautiously, alert for any signs of recent activity. The door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, partly open. Inside, dust covered everything: a small table, a single chair, a wood-burning stove in the corner. It looked as if no one had been here in decades, but according to the map, this place, LB7, was significant. Jackson began a systematic search, checking the walls for hidden compartments, looking under the floorboards, examining the stove for any secrets it might conceal. It was the stove that finally yielded something. Behind it, a section of the wall had been constructed differently than the rest. The logs were the same, but they were fitted together in a way that allowed one to slide aside, revealing a narrow space beyond. Inside that space was a metal box, similar to the one he had found in the cellar. With trembling hands, Jackson pulled it out and set it on the dusty table. Like the previous box, this one opened easily. Inside was a leather-bound journal, much newer than Thompson's, and a sealed envelope with J.M. written on it in elegant handwriting, James Miller, his grandfather. Jackson opened the envelope first. Inside was a letter dated September 1963. "Charlie, I've done as you asked. The ledgers are hidden at LB7 where we agreed. All records of the experiments are there too. I'm taking my family and leaving, Eleanor's family or not. I want no further part in this. The farm is yours, as is my share of the proceeds, but I keep what I learned. That knowledge is my insurance policy. If anything happens to me or mine, the authorities will receive a detailed account of everything. The samples are where we discussed. Use them wisely or not at all. James Miller." Experiments? Samples? Jackson's confusion deepened as he turned to the journal. It was a scientific notebook, filled with chemical formulas, observations, and data tables. Many entries referenced compound LB7 and its effects on various test subjects. The language was technical, beyond Jackson's understanding, but certain phrases stood out. Remarkable regenerative properties, accelerated growth, unexpected side effects in human subjects. As Jackson flipped through the pages, a black and white photograph fell out, a group of men in lab coats standing in what looked like an underground facility. He recognized his grandfather and Charlie Thompson from the previous photo, but they were younger here, perhaps in their 30s. On a table in front of them were trays of plants, unusual-looking specimens with distinctive five-lobed leaves. Jackson stared at the photo for a long moment. The pieces were beginning to come together. The Brotherhood hadn't been smuggling drugs or alcohol. They had been developing them, creating some kind of experimental compound derived from plants, testing its effects, and presumably selling the results. And according to his grandfather's letter, samples of whatever they had created were still hidden somewhere on the property. As Jackson gathered the journal and letter to take back to the house, a twig snapped in the woods outside. He froze, suddenly alert to the fact that he was alone in a remote location with potentially valuable information. Silently he moved to the cabin door and peered out. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, tall, dressed in dark clothes, watching the cabin with an intensity that sent a chill down Jackson's spine. It wasn't Ray or Edward Thompson. It was someone he hadn't seen before, someone who had apparently followed him into the woods. Jackson stepped back from the door, heart pounding. The map, the journals, his grandfather's letter. They had all warned of danger, of people who might still be looking for the Brotherhood's secrets decades later. And now, it seemed, one of those people had found him. Jackson's mind raced as he assessed his options. The cabin had no back door, no windows large enough to escape through. The only way out was past the stranger watching from the trees. He quickly tucked the journal and letter into his backpack, took a deep breath, and stepped outside, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "Can I help you?" he called to the figure at the edge of the clearing. The man stepped forward, emerging fully from the shadows of the trees. He was older than Jackson had initially thought, in his 60s perhaps, with silver hair cut military short and a body that, while lean, suggested considerable strength for his age. He wore dark jeans, a black jacket, and boots that looked well-worn but expensive. "Jackson Miller," the man said. It wasn't a question. His voice was deep, with a slight accent Jackson couldn't place. "Charlie always said someone would come back for it eventually. I didn't expect it to be James's grandson." Jackson tensed, ready to run if necessary. "Who are you?" "Dr. Victor Reeves," the man replied, remaining where he was, as if sensing Jackson's unease. "I was part of the research team, one of the few still alive." "The Brotherhood," Jackson said. Reeves grimaced. "That's what Charlie called it. A bit melodramatic for my taste. We were scientists, not a cult. Scientists who went into hiding," Jackson noted, "who conducted illegal experiments." "Not illegal at the time," Reeves corrected. "Unauthorized, perhaps. Controversial, certainly. But we were pushing boundaries that needed pushing." He nodded toward the cabin. "I see you found James's backup records. Interesting reading, I imagine. Why are you following me?" "I wasn't following you specifically," Reeves said. "I monitor this area, have done for decades. When there's activity at the old Thompson place, I take notice." He paused. "Especially when that activity involves someone searching the property systematically, checking all of Charlie's old hiding spots." Jackson's mind whirled. This man, Reeves, had been watching him from the beginning, had probably seen him discover the money in the attic, find the map in the cellar, maybe even observed his conversations with Ray, Edward, and Abigail. "What do you want?" Jackson asked, his hand tightening on his backpack strap. "The same thing everyone wants," Reeves replied calmly. "The formula, the samples, the original research that could finally allow us to complete what we started 40 years ago." "And what exactly did you start?" Jackson demanded. "The journal mentions experiments, test subjects. What were you people doing out here? You people—" Reeves studied him for a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "We were developing a compound that could revolutionize medicine as we know it. Accelerated healing, tissue regeneration, extended longevity. LB7 was the breakthrough, a synthetic compound derived from a rare plant species we cultivated here. You were making some kind of miracle drug," Jackson said skeptically. "We were making the future," Reeves corrected, "until it all fell apart. The side effects became problematic, and then there were ethical concerns among certain team members." He gave Jackson a pointed look. "Your grandfather chief among them." "My grandfather left the project. James got cold feet," Reeves said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "He was our best chemist, the one who created the most stable version of the compound. When he left, he took key research with him, research we never recovered." Jackson's mind flashed to his grandfather's letter. "The samples are where we discussed." "And you think I know where this research is? I think it's no coincidence that James Miller's grandson has returned to the farm after all these years. I think blood calls to blood, as Charlie used to say." Reeves took a step closer. "I don't want trouble, Jackson. I just want to finish what we started. The potential benefits of LB7 are too great to remain buried. Think of the lives that could be saved. If it's so beneficial, why all the secrecy? Why hide in the woods for decades instead of taking your research public?" A shadow passed over Reeves's face. "The pharmaceutical companies got involved, then the government. They wanted to weaponize our work, turn a medical breakthrough into a military advantage. We refused, went underground, and then people started dying. Accidents, suicides, disappearances. Charlie was one of the last. So it wasn't just about money," Jackson said, pieces clicking into place. "It was about control." "It's always about control," Reeves said wearily. "Charlie thought if we just held out long enough, found a buyer, we could ensure the research was used properly. Your grandfather disagreed, thought the whole project should be destroyed." He fixed Jackson with an intense stare. "But he didn't destroy it, did he? He hid it, and I think you're close to finding it." Jackson said nothing, unwilling to confirm or deny. The journal in his backpack felt suddenly heavier, more significant. "I can help you, you know," Reeves continued after a moment. "I understand the research. In a way you can't. I know what we were trying to accomplish, what went wrong, and how to fix it. Together, we could complete your grandfather's work, make it safe, make it available to those who need it." It was a compelling pitch, delivered with apparent sincerity. But Jackson had learned to be wary of people offering deals, especially when those deals involved secrets worth millions. "I'll think about it," he said noncommittally. Reeves nodded as if he had expected nothing more. He reached into his jacket and produced a business card. "My number. Call me when you're ready to talk, or if you find yourself in over your head. There are others looking for the formula who aren't as, diplomatic as I am." As Jackson took the card, Reeves added, "A word of advice. Be careful around the Harkers. Ray may seem like a simple farmer, but he has his own agenda where LB7 is concerned, and his daughter is sharper than she lets on." With that cryptic warning, Reeves turned and disappeared back into the woods, moving with a sureness that suggested intimate familiarity with the terrain. Jackson stood in the clearing for several minutes after Reeves had gone, processing this latest development. The mystery was expanding, becoming more complex with each new piece of information. What had begun as a desperate purchase of an abandoned farm had evolved into a scientific conspiracy involving experimental compounds, government interests, and family secrets spanning generations. By the time Jackson made it back to the farmhouse, the sun was high in the sky. He spread his grandfather's journal out on the kitchen table alongside Thompson's journal and the map. comparing entries and looking for patterns. The scientific notations were largely beyond his understanding, but certain things became clear. LB7 was a compound derived from a plant the Brotherhood had cultivated in secret greenhouses on the property. Initial tests had shown remarkable medical potential, but later entries documented concerning side effects, including behavioral anomalies and accelerated cellular degradation. There were frequent references to the vault, a secure storage facility where the most valuable research was kept. According to the journals, the vault contained not just documentation, but actual samples of the compound, and, most importantly, the original plants from which it was derived. But the location of this vault remained elusive. Thompson's map showed the tunnel system and various outbuildings, but nothing labeled as a vault or secure storage. His grandfather's journal contained formulas and experimental data, but no specific location information. As Jackson pored over the documents, a new thought struck him. What if the vault wasn't on the Thompson property at all? What if his grandfather, mistrusting Thompson and the others, had hidden the most crucial materials elsewhere? He returned to his grandfather's letter. The samples are where we discussed. Not on the Thompson farm, but somewhere else. Somewhere only James Miller and Charlie Thompson knew about. Jackson's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car coming up the driveway. Quickly he gathered the journals and map and hid them under a loose floorboard in the bedroom, a hiding place he had discovered during his systematic search of the house. Through the window, he saw a familiar black sedan. Edward Thompson was. Backer Jackson steeled himself and went to the door. Whatever Edward wanted, it was unlikely to be a friendly visit after their tense conversation the day before. Edward stood on the porch, impeccably dressed as before, but with a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been present during his first visit. "We need to talk," he said without preamble. "Things have changed." "What things?" Jackson asked, not inviting him in. "Victor Reeves is back in the area," Edward said, his voice low. "He was seen near town yesterday, and again this morning, heading toward these woods." Jackson kept his expression neutral, though internally he was surprised by Edward's apparent network of informants. "Who is Victor Reeves?" he asked, feigning ignorance. Edward's eyes narrowed. "Don't play dumb, Miller. If you're here looking for what I think you're looking for, you know exactly who Reeves is. He was Charlie's right-hand man in the Brotherhood. The true believer. If he's sniffing around, it means he thinks the vault is still here, still intact. And what does that have to do with me?" "It means you're in danger," Edward said bluntly. "Reeves isn't the only one watching this place. The people who shut down the Brotherhood 40 years ago never stopped monitoring. They want to make sure LB7 stays buried permanently. If they think you've found it or are close to finding it—" He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. "Why are you telling me this?" Jackson asked. "Yesterday you were threatening legal action if I didn't share what I found." "Because the situation has escalated," Edward replied. "I wanted the research for historical purposes, for closure about my uncle's disappearance. But if Reeves is involved, and if the others are watching, it's become much more dangerous." He hesitated. "Charlie was my uncle, but he wasn't a good man. What they were doing here with LB7, it went too far. People got hurt." The sincerity in Edward's voice was unexpected. For the first time, Jackson considered that Edward might have more complex motivations than simple greed. "What do you suggest?" Jackson asked cautiously. "Stop looking," Edward said. "Pack up what you've found so far, sell the farm and disappear. It's what your father did, and he's still alive because of it." The mention of his father sent a jolt through Jackson. "You said he's in Arizona, under the name Richard Matthews." Edward nodded. "Last I heard. But he moves around, changes identities every few years. He knows they're still looking." "They," Jackson repeated. "The government, pharmaceutical companies. Who exactly is this mysterious they?" "All of the above and more," Edward said grimly. "LB7 wasn't just a medical breakthrough, Jackson. In Its final formulation, it was something much more, something that could change the fundamental nature of human biology, the kind of thing powerful interests don't want in unpredictable hands. Jackson felt a chill run through him. What had his grandfather been involved in creating, and what responsibility did that place on him now? "I need time to think," he said finally. Edward reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Your father's last known address and phone number. If you decide to get out, call him first. He knows how to disappear properly." He handed Jackson the paper. "You have until tomorrow to decide. After that, I'm leaving town, and I suggest you do the same." As Edward drove away, Jackson stood on the porch, the paper clutched in his hand. The farm that had seemed like his last desperate chance at a fresh start now felt like a ticking time bomb. But with each new revelation, each piece of the puzzle that fell into place, he found it harder to walk away. This wasn't just about money anymore, or even about family history. It was about a scientific discovery that had been hidden for decades, a discovery his grandfather had helped create and then tried to protect the world from. What would he find if he kept digging? And could he live with himself if he walked away? Now, leaving the secrets of LB7 buried for someone else to discover, Jackson spent a restless night, his mind churning with everything he had learned. The money in the attic, the scientific journals, the mysterious LB7 compound, his grandfather's involvement, his father's disappearance. It all swirled together in a conspiracy that spanned decades and had somehow pulled him into its orbit. By dawn, he had made his decision. He couldn't walk away. Not yet. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. Most importantly, there was the question of what exactly LB7 was and whether it should remain hidden or be brought to light. With newfound determination, Jackson returned to his grandfather's journal, this time focusing not on the scientific formulas, but on the personal notes scribbled in the margins. James Miller had been methodical, but he was also human. If he had hidden something of great value, there might be clues in his more casual observations. One notation in particular caught Jackson's eye. "E's birthday tomorrow. She wants to visit the old place. Too risky, but hard to refuse her. Roses still bloom there, even after all these years." Eleanor, Jackson's grandmother, the old place must refer to somewhere significant to her, somewhere with roses. But where? Jackson thought back to the county records he had examined. Eleanor's maiden name was Thompson. Was she related to Charlie? A sister, perhaps, or a cousin? If so, the old place might be an original Thompson family property. He grabbed his phone and called the county records office. Mrs. Grayson answered on the third ring. "Mrs. Grayson, it's Jackson Miller. I need information on property owned by the Thompson family prior to 1963, particularly any property that might have been significant to my grandmother, Eleanor Thompson Miller." "The Thompson homestead," Mrs. Grayson replied immediately. "Beautiful old Victorian place about 5 miles east of where you are now. Eleanor grew up there. The property was sold out of the family in the 1950s, but I recall your grandmother was heartbroken about it. She had a rose garden there, quite famous locally." Jackson's pulse quickened. "Is the property still there? Who owns it now?" "It's abandoned, has been for years. The land belongs to Millfield County now, after the last owner died without heirs. The house is still standing, but barely. No one goes out there much anymore." After getting directions from Mrs. Grayson, Jackson set out immediately. The old Thompson homestead was at the end of a long, neglected driveway, almost entirely reclaimed by nature. The house itself was a grand Victorian structure, or had been once. Now it was a decaying shell with broken windows and a partially collapsed roof. But as Jackson approached, he saw what he was looking for: a rose garden, overgrown but unmistakable, with bushes still stubbornly producing blooms despite decades of neglect. This was where his grandmother had grown up, where she had cultivated roses, where she had brought his grandfather decades ago, and, Jackson suspected, where James Miller had hidden the most crucial elements of the LB7 research. The front door of the old house hung precariously on rusted hinges. Inside, the floors were rotted in places, requiring careful navigation. Jackson moved through the abandoned rooms, trying to imagine his grandmother as a young woman here, meeting his grandfather, falling in love. Had James Miller hidden his research here as a testament to that love? A way of connecting his scientific work to the personal? In what must have once been a grand parlor, Jackson noticed something odd, a portion of the decorative wainscoting that didn't quite match the rest. The wood was similar but not identical, as if it had been replaced at some point. He pressed against it, and to his surprise it moved slightly. Heart racing, Jackson pushed harder. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was what he had been searching for. A metal strongbox, modern and secure, with a combination lock. Jackson stared at it, momentarily stymied. What would his grandfather have used as a combination? A birth date? An anniversary? Then he remembered the notation in the journal. E's birthday tomorrow. His grandmother's birthday. But what was it? He pulled out his phone and called Mrs. Grayson again. I'm sorry to bother you, but would you happen to know my grandmother Eleanor's birth date? April 17th, 1927. Mrs. Grayson replied without hesitation. I remember because it was the same as my mother's, just 10 years apart. Jackson tried the combination, 4 to 1727. The lock clicked open. Inside the strongbox was exactly what everyone had been searching for, a sealed metal container labeled LB7 Original Specimens, a thick folder of research notes labeled Complete, Formula and Synthesis Protocol, and a personal letter addressed simply to my grandson. With trembling hands, Jackson opened the letter. If you're reading this, then you've found what many have sought. I don't know your name, or what kind of man you've become, but you are my blood, and that means something. LB7 was meant to heal, to save lives. But in our ambition, we created something more dangerous than we intended. The compound doesn't just heal tissue. It fundamentally alters human cellular structure, creating something neither fully human nor fully plant. The side effects were unpredictable, sometimes monstrous. I couldn't destroy what we had created. The potential for good was too great. But I couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands either. So I hid it here, in the place most precious to your grandmother, protected by the only security that matters, family. You have a choice now. You can destroy it all, ensuring it never falls into the wrong hands. You can turn it over to the authorities, though I warn you they may not have humanity's best interests at heart. Or you can take up where I left off, find a way to harness the good while eliminating the danger. Whatever you decide, remember this: power is neither good nor evil. It is the hand that wields it that determines its nature. With love and faith, your grandfather, James Miller. Jackson sat back on his heels, overwhelmed by the responsibility that had been placed on his shoulders. His grandfather had trusted that whoever found this, whoever shared his blood, would make the right choice. But what was the right choice? As he contemplated this question, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch outside. He quickly gathered everything into his backpack and moved to a position where he could see the front door, without being immediately visible. Abigail Harker stepped into the house, her movements cautious but purposeful. She was alone, unarmed, but her expression was resolute. "Jackson," she called. "I know you're here. Ray saw you heading this way." She paused, surveying the dilapidated interior. "You found it, didn't you? What my father and Edward and Reeves have been looking for all these years." Jackson stepped into view, keeping his backpack close. "How were you involved in all this, Abigail?" She sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "My mother was one of the test subjects for LB7. A willing one at first. She had cancer, terminal. LB 7.5 put it in remission, something no conventional treatment could do, but the side effects—" She trailed off, her expression haunted. She wasn't herself anymore. The changes weren't just physical. Her mind, her personality, everything changed. "I'm sorry," Jackson said, genuinely moved by the pain in her voice. The Harker farm was where they grew the plants used in LB7. Abigail continued. "Dad was the botanist, the one who crossbred the original specimens to create what they needed. When things went wrong, when people started dying or worse, he wanted out. But by then, it was too late." "And now?" Jackson asked. "What does he want now?" "Peace," Abigail said simply. "Closure. The formula destroyed, the samples eliminated, the whole thing finally put to rest." She stepped closer. "That's why I came. To offer the lease. I wanted to keep an eye on you, make sure you didn't find what you weren't looking for. But I see I'm too late." Jackson studied her, trying to determine if she was being truthful. There was a rawness to her pain that seemed genuine, a directness that contrasted with the cryptic warnings and half-truths he had received from others. "I found more than the formula," he said finally. "I found a letter from my grandfather explaining why he hid it all. He left the decision to me: destroy it, turn it over to authorities, or continue the research." "And what will you do?" Abigail asked, her voice soft but intense. It was the question Jackson had been asking himself since finding the letter. What was the right path? Reeves believed in the potential of LB7, wanted to complete the research for medical benefits. Edward and Ray wanted it destroyed, the past, and buried. Various shadowy interests wanted it for power, for weapons, for control, but none of them had been entrusted with the decision by James Miller. None of them had found what Jackson had found, where he had found it. None of them had the perspective of both an outsider and a blood relation, someone connected to the legacy, but not blinded by personal involvement in its creation. "I'm going to do what my grandfather couldn't," Jackson said, the decision crystallizing as he spoke. "I'm going to bring it into the light, but on my terms, not to the government, not to pharmaceutical companies, but to independent researchers, ethicists, and medical professionals who can evaluate it properly, transparently, with public oversight." Abigail looked skeptical. "You think they'll let you do that? Reeves, Edward, the others watching this place?" "I think they won't have a choice," Jackson replied, "because I'm not going to give them the only copy. I'm going to digitize everything, encrypt it, and set it to release to multiple sources if anything happens to me. The days of LB7 being a buried secret are over. It's time for transparency." A slow smile spread across Abigail's face. "You sound like your grandfather. Dad said James Miller was the only one of them with both principles and pragmatism." She hesitated, then added, "I want to help. Not just because I want this resolved, but because it's the right thing to do. My family was part of creating this problem. I should be part of solving it." Jackson considered her offer. Having an ally, especially one who understood the local context and had connections to the original research, would be invaluable. And there was something about Abigail, a straightforwardness, a principle, that reminded him of what he had read about his grandfather. "Okay," he said finally, "but we do this right. No secrets between us, no hidden agendas." Abigail nodded, her expression solemn. No secrets. 3 months later, Jackson stood on the porch of the farmhouse, now almost fully restored. The fields were being prepared for spring planting, not with commercial crops, but with specialized research plots managed by a team of botanical geneticists. The barn had been converted into a state-of-the-art laboratory, and the once-abandoned property hummed with purposeful activity. Edward Thompson had initially been furious when Jackson announced his plans for the LB7 research, but had eventually come around, contributing his own family records to the project. Ray Harker, after initial skepticism, had agreed to serve as a consultant on the botanical aspects. Victor Reeves had disappeared again, though Jackson suspected he was watching from a distance, perhaps waiting to see if Jackson's approach would succeed where the Brotherhood had failed. Most surprisingly, Jackson's father had reached out after receiving the encrypted files Jackson had sent to his Arizona address. After decades in hiding, Robert Miller, or Richard Matthews as he now called himself, had expressed a cautious willingness to reconnect, to share what he knew about his father's work and the events that had driven him into hiding. The money from the attic had been invested in the farm's restoration and the initial research setup. But the real value, as Charlie Thompson had written, was never in the cash. It was in the knowledge, the potential, the responsibility of using power wisely. As the sun set over the fields his grandfather had once worked, Jackson felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. His desperate purchase of an abandoned farm, his last $900 spent on what had seemed like a final, futile gamble, had led him not just to financial security, but to purpose, to family history, to a legacy worth honoring. Abigail joined him on the porch, coffee mugs in hand. Over the past months, their partnership had evolved into something more personal, a connection built on shared purpose and mutual respect. "The first controlled trials start next week," she said, handing him a mug. "The modified LB7 compound. Looks promising. All the healing properties, none of the genetic instability." Jackson nodded, taking the mug gratefully. "My grandfather would be proud. Using science for its original purpose, to heal, to improve lives. And to bring things into the light," Abigail added, leaning against the porch railing. "No more secrets. No more hidden brotherhoods. No more secrets," Jackson agreed, watching as the last light faded from the sky, giving way to stars emerging one by one. The abandoned farm that had once seemed like his last desperate chance had become something more, a beginning rather than an end, a future built on the foundations of the past, a fortune measured not in dollars, but in the potential to change, lives for the better. And that, Jackson reflected as he stood in the gathering darkness, was the greatest discovery of all. 1 year had passed since Jackson Miller spent his last $900 on an abandoned farm. 1 year since he discovered the money in the attic, the journals in the cellar, and the scientific secrets that had changed his life forever. The farmhouse, once dilapidated and forgotten, now stood proudly restored. Fresh paint gleamed in the morning sun, new windows reflected the clear blue sky, and the porch that had once sagged precariously now welcomed visitors with solid wooden steps and comfortable rocking chairs. Jackson sat in one of those chairs, coffee in hand, watching as researchers moved between the farmhouse and the converted barn that now served as their laboratory. The fields that had been overgrown with weeds now contained carefully managed research plots where botanists studied variants of the plants used to create LB7. His decision to bring the research into the light had not been without challenges. Victor Reeves had initially threatened legal action, claiming ownership of the research as a surviving member of the Brotherhood. Edward Thompson had tried to persuade Jackson to destroy everything, warning of consequences that would follow if he didn't. But Jackson had stood firm, backed by the unexpected alliance he had formed with Abigail Harker. Together, they had created a non-profit research foundation dedicated to developing medical applications from the original LB7 formula, applications that would be available to all, not controlled by corporate interests or government agencies. The gauging money from the attic, $50,000 that had once seemed like a fortune to a man down to his last few hundred, had been just enough to begin the process. But it was the patents based on his grandfather's research that had provided the real funding. Modified versions of the LB7 compound were now in early clinical trials, showing promise for treating conditions that had previously been considered untreatable. Jackson's phone buzzed with a message from Abigail. Meeting with the ethics committee. At 10, don't be late this time, he smiled, pocketing the phone. Abigail had become more than a business partner over the past year. Their shared purpose had evolved into something deeper, a connection based on mutual respect and understanding. She challenged him, supported him, and kept him honest when the temptations of power and money threatened to distract him from their mission. As Jackson prepared to leave for the meeting, a car came up the driveway, an unfamiliar sedan, dust-covered from the rural roads. He paused, watching as it parked beside his truck. The driver who emerged was a man in his 60s, tall and weathered, with a face that Jackson recognized immediately from family photographs. It was his father, Robert Miller, now known as Richard Matthews, finally coming to see the farm in person after months of cautious communication by phone and email. "Dad," Jackson said, the words still feeling strange on his tongue after so many years believing his father was dead. Robert Richard stood awkwardly by his car as if uncertain of his welcome. "Jackson, the place looks good, better than I remembered." There was so much to say, so many questions still unanswered. Why had his father faked his death? Had his mother known the truth? What had driven him away from his family and kept him in hiding for decades? But in that moment, standing on the porch of the farmhouse where his family's story had begun, Jackson chose to focus on the present rather than the past. "Want to see what we've done with grandfather's research?" he asked. Relief flickered across his father's face, gratitude for being offered a way forward rather than an immediate reckoning with the past. "I'd like that." As they walked toward the lab, Jackson gave a brief overview of the Foundation's work. "We've modified the original formula, eliminated the genetic instability issues. The healing properties remain, but without the side effects. Grandfather documented." His father nodded, absorbing the information. "Your grandfather would be proud. He always hoped someone would finish what he started, the right way, out in the open. Is that why he hid everything here? Why he left the letter addressed to his grandson?" "He believed in bloodlines, in family connection," his father replied. "He trusted that whoever found his research would make the right decision because they shared his blood, his values." He glanced at Jackson. He was right. They reached the lab, where Abigail was waiting. If she was surprised to see Robert Richard, she didn't show it. She simply extended her hand and introduced herself. "Ms. Harker," his father said, recognition in his eyes. "You look like your mother." A shadow passed over Abigail's face. "You knew her. She was one of the first patients to receive LB7. I was there for the early trials." He hesitated. "I'm sorry for what happened to her. We didn't understand the compound fully then. That's why we're doing this," Abigail said, her voice steady, "to make sure her suffering wasn't for nothing." Inside the lab, researchers were analyzing plant samples, running computer models, and monitoring test results. It was a far cry from the secretive operation the Brotherhood had run decades earlier, transparent, ethical, focused on healing rather than profit or power. As his father spoke with the research team, sharing insights from the early days of LB7's development, Jackson found himself reflecting on the strange journey that had brought him here. He had spent his last $900 on this abandoned farm out of desperation, hoping merely for shelter, for a chance to rebuild his life from rock bottom. Instead, he had found something invaluable: purpose, connection, and the opportunity to transform his grandfather's complicated legacy into something unambiguously good. The farmhouse that had once been a symbol of his failure, a last desperate purchase when he had nowhere else to go, was now the center of groundbreaking medical research. The family history he had never known had given him roots, a sense of belonging he had lacked his entire life. And the money in the attic, the hidden fortune that had seemed so miraculous at first, had proven to be just the beginning of a much greater treasure. That evening, as the sun set over the farm, Jackson, his father, and Abigail sat on the porch, sharing stories and planning for the future. There were still challenges ahead, ethical questions to navigate, resistance from pharmaceutical companies who saw their work as a threat, the ongoing mystery of what had happened to Charlie Thompson. But for the first time in his life, Jackson felt truly at peace. The abandoned farm that had once represented his lowest point had become his greatest blessing, not just financially, but in every way that mattered. Sometimes, he reflected as he watched the fireflies emerge in the gathering darkness, the most valuable discoveries aren't the ones we seek, but the ones that find us when we need them most.